The New Yorker called my next guest's book contentious, forceful, and salutary. Yasha Levine has been on the program before. He is a journalist. He's a former editor of the Moscow-based satirical newspaper, The Exile. He is the author of Surveillance Valley, The Secret Military History of the Internet, which is a fascinating book. And he is the author of a recent article in The Baffler about the Electronic Frontier Foundation, which we've covered. We've had guests from the EFF on the program. And I thought it was quite interesting, so I asked him back. So first of all, Yasha, thanks for coming back on the program.
It's always a pleasure. Thanks for having me.
Tell me, what got you thinking about the Electronic Frontier Foundation? What was the inspiration for writing an article looking into them?
Well, I mean, I had come across the Electronic Frontier Foundation, of course, years ago, even probably before I was really a journalist. But in my capacity as a journalist, I started really coming across them and noticing them a lot more and paying attention to them a lot more when I started covering the business of Silicon Valley, the for-profit surveillance business of Silicon Valley. And one thing that I noticed about EFF that I couldn't really understand why it was doing this, but I started noticing it right away when I looked into the business of Silicon Valley, was that the Electronic Frontier Foundation didn't really have a position on private surveillance. It was very good on government surveillance. It stood up to the Patriot Act and the Bush era expansion of government surveillance powers. But in the realm of private surveillance, the kind of surveillance that we are, as users of the internet, exposed to on a daily, minute by minute, second by second basis, and the kind of thing that underlies the business of Silicon Valley, right? Companies like Google, companies like Facebook, they make money through for-profit surveillance and then targeting us with advertising and influence based on data that is gathered through that surveillance. So I was always surprised that EFF took a very agnostic position on private matters of surveillance. And so that was what's really got me interested in why that is. Why does EFF make this hard distinction between government surveillance and private surveillance when there isn't, when the division is actually much more muddy and hard to define? So that was years ago when I first started covering Silicon Valley, and over time I began to understand that EFF is not exactly the organization that many people think it is. And I began to see it much more in terms of it being a business lobbyist, a Silicon Valley lobby group, rather than a defender of people's digital rights.
So and I want to put that into some context. First of all, in terms of, for our viewers that may have not seen our previous segments with you, your book addresses the military research that went into the creation of the tech that drives the Silicon Valley and the decision to turn it over to the private sector. And of course, that perimeter between public and private surveillance is also muddy because some of these tech companies work for the government. They have shared their data with the government. Our emails are often read, at least header information, by the government. So point well taken about the muddiness of that barrier between the two. And I guess one of the things I got from reading your piece in the Baffler, all effed up, it's called EFF apostrophe D, was the fact that, and I hadn't really focused on it before. I think somewhere in my mind I had also noticed that they weren't doing much about private sector espionage, if you will, or spying, whatever you want to call it, surveillance, I guess is the best word. But I hadn't really put a pattern behind it. And one of the things that you point out quickly becomes evident as you go over the history is that while they've taken some, as you say, very good stands, the stands that they take always, and the ones that they neglect to take, the pattern is that it's always in the interests of the tech industry. That, you know, secure phones save lives. Well, that's Apple's position on phones. So in that case, I guess they opposed the government, but that was in the interests of a big tech company. At other times, they've gone after the government in different ways, but also to protect tech. So I guess what I get out of it is, I'm not framing my question well, so forgive me for that, but I guess basically...
I agree with everything you've said. Yeah.
Oh, okay, good. Well, that gives me encouragement to continue. Thank you. Okay, I'm going to take a different tack. John Perry Barlow, you mentioned him in your piece, and I think you said, you know, an incoherent but widely lauded rant that was, he's one of the founders, unfortunately has passed away, but he wrote this piece, you know, you ancient monoliths or whatever of government, stay out of our new invisible world of cyberspace, this Declaration of Rights of cyberspace. But it didn't really, I'm trying to remember, I don't think it ever said anything about you giant corporations that try to crush our individuality and exploit our time and effort for profit. I don't think it said anything about them, did it?
No. Look, it's a part of the libertarian ideology. John Perry Barlow very eloquently and forcefully, I think, encapsulated the dominant ideology of Silicon Valley and generally the position that the Electronic Frontier Foundation takes. And that is that letting corporations, letting the private sector do its thing, letting the market work its magic, and letting companies innovate and grow however they choose to, right? That is where freedom is. That is where the future of democracy is in this digital world. Now, anything that the government tries to do in terms of regulating these innovators or regulating this new and amazing cyberspace frontier is equated with totalitarianism and basically taking us backwards, taking us towards something that is bad and negative. And so unleashing the creative juices of the free market is, you know, that's what John Perry Barlow wanted to do, except he applied it to cyberspace, to the internet, right? And he likened it to the frontier, right? The American Western frontier that was open and that, you know, had all this opportunity and abundance and a kind of a new American future. And he wanted the government to stay completely out of that space and let individuals, companies, whatever, right, do their thing completely without any kind of government interference. You know, and it's interesting, that analogy that he makes, right? He uses the metaphor of the Wild West, of the American Western frontier for the internet. And it's, I mean, at the time maybe it made sense, but it seems a little weird because, right, the real frontier wasn't like an empty place where just white settlers from Europe could come in and build a new world for themselves, right? It was populated, sometimes very heavily populated by people who had been there for thousands of years. And so in order for this new world to come into being, this new frontier, this new America, a lot of people had to be wiped out, and there was genocide. And so,
and there was a genocide, just to add, there was a genocide, and there was also brutal treatment of the people that came in to replace those who had been exterminated and driven out. I mean, there was exploitation of Chinese and other laborers. Or it was basically, it was a very rough place to live. So this identity, you know, Barlow and I, you know, interesting mind in many ways, lyricist for the Grateful Dead and so on. But you know, he was a rancher. He was from, I think, Wyoming or something, and he bought into this mythos, and I have his declaration in front of me, governments of the industrial world, you weary giants of flesh and steel, I come from cyberspace, the new home of the mind, leave us alone, you are not welcome, you have no sovereignty when we gather. It's all, we have no elected government, nor are we likely to have one. So I address you with no greater authority than that which liberty itself always speaks. Well, places that have no elected governments are generally referred to as dictatorships. And that's what generally happens. But the libertarian ethos is based on a mythology of freedom. And the reason why I bring this all up, and I welcome any further comments you have, is because
Sure.
I think on Barlow I think that he was a rhetorician, and ideological voice that complemented the economic interests of the Valley, and that in reading your piece, it occurred to me that I don't know exactly the sequencing of how it all came together, but in effect, there was an ideological gloss given on actions that benefited a very profit-driven, aggressive profit-driven industry.
Yes. Look, I mean, the internet came out of the Pentagon. It was a Pentagon project. It was developed by the Pentagon through the 60s and 70s. To create a modern command and control system for the Pentagon, to create a system that would allow the Pentagon to have total situational awareness around the world, to create the underlying technology for that. Now, when this technology started going into the private sector and started to be privatized by the government, this was the 80s, and specifically the late 80s and the early 90s, and this was the time when ideologically America was in the grips of a very neoliberal, very deregulatory kind of fervor, where the government was seen as something to be reduced, to be lanced like a boil, right? And you lance the government, you lance that boil, and you let the free market do its thing. You privatize as much as you can, and so this was happening, right, under Reagan, under Bush, under Clinton, and so the internet, as it was coming into being, and people were beginning to use it, and companies were starting to come online, and the culture was being born. The culture came out of that place, out of a very free market-oriented, libertarian idea of how the world works and how the world should work. Right? It's a very utopian idea, but it's based. So it didn't come out of nowhere. Harry Barlow's idea of the internet is something that was comes right out of culture and is very much in sync with culture. It didn't seem very strange or far out to people when he wrote that, right? I mean, it's just that it was basically saying, look, there's this amazing industry that's coming online, this internet world that no one really understands, no one knows where the future will take it, but it's the future, and we want the government to stay the hell out. And he, as the co-founder of EFF, put that into the DNA of the organization, and EFF has been doing that nonstop since basically 1990 when it was founded. It's basically been arguing against government regulation of any kind, whether it's Silicon Valley now today in companies like Google and Facebook, or when in the early 90s there was a lobbyist for the emerging internet service provider industry. It was arguing for deregulation and voluntary regulation, essentially, of the industry by the industry, and it's doing the same thing today.
And one of the reasons why, thanks for that, because I think one of the reasons why this conversation is important is because, I think people, and I don't mean to pick on Barlow. I'm sorry he passed away relatively young, and I don't want deadheads mad at me. And and I have mutual people who are friends with him. But it is an important conversation to have, very important, I think, because, for example, when John writes, governments, excuse me, let me find the bit. We did not invite you. Governments, gosh darn it, I miss it. He basically frames the government as an invader. You claim there are problems among us you need to solve. You use this claim as an excuse to invade our precincts. Cyberspace does not lie within your borders. Do not think you can build it. Now that, to me, is a fascinating statement, because government did build cyberspace. And, to me, I've known that for a long time, and what your book, Surveillance Valley, told me was there was military reasoning behind it, but the very premise of digital libertarianism that was articulated by Barlow and perhaps is embodied by the Electronic Frontier Foundation and other initiatives is faulty, because it is based on the notion that cyberspace organically came into being and that government doesn't belong there. It is a creature of the government, is it not?
Yeah, I mean, it's a total, yes. I mean, that's a very good point, and it's important to remember that, to remind people of that. The internet was created by the U.S. government. It was created with U.S. taxpayer money, with funds. It was created, first it started in the Pentagon, and it came out of the Pentagon, and its first civilian iteration was actually still under the federal government, under the National Science Foundation. And the National Science Foundation built the first civilian national network with a national backbone and regional ISPs that were all funded by the federal government. That was called the NSFnet, the National Science Foundation network, that connected universities. And it was this network that was privatized starting in the late 80s and completing, I think, around 1994. And that became the internet, the first seed of the internet. Of course, it grew after that very quickly, but the first scaffolding of the private internet that we use now was actually created with government funds, both defense funds and civilian federal money. And so, when he was writing that, what year was that when he wrote that declaration? Do you remember?
I don't remember offhand, but pretty early on, early 90s, I would say. 1996.
Okay, 1996. So this was a year. I think the internet was finally privatized fully in 1995, because it was done in stages. So that would have been a year, maybe a year and a half after the internet had finally been privatized. So at that point, the government had been out of the internet more or less for only a year, and so here he is, completely, basically giving a spin to the whole thing, pretending like it came out of nowhere. And so and of course, I have to say that I think Barlow here is playing the role not just of a naive optimist, but I think as a kind of a propagandist, because he knew at the time, I'm sure, where the internet came from, because he had been one of the earliest users of this technology. And at the time, everyone understood that it came out of the Pentagon, especially people that were close to it. And so it's interesting to hear him phrase it that way, because it's a total, it's a complete whitewash of the history. And that whitewash, of course, serves the interests of this budding internet industry, because they want to position themselves as the creators of this technology. They want to be given power of this technology over regulating themselves and regulating the direction that this technology takes. And at a big kind of boost that they get in terms of legitimacy for that is to claim that they're the ones who made it. It's private industry who made it. It wasn't the government. It wasn't the public that essentially allowed and funded this network to come into being. And so this piece of the mythology of the internet is very important to the industry. It's where they draw their legitimacy from.
And it's also important in another sense. And again, we're talking with Yasha Levine, author of Surveillance Valley, and a new article about the Electronic Freedom Foundation, because it's really it's in the interests of certain groups like these to enforce or amplify the power of certain corporations and economic interests at the expense of others. So there's really almost an internecine struggle within the capitalist economy, if you will. And here's what I mean by that. For example, I'm a songwriter, and you don't make a lot of money from songs you wrote that were recorded in the 1970s or whatever anymore. I never did. I mean, I always say the internet owes me $35 for my lost royalties. But, Barlow, and again, your legal concepts of property expression, identity, movement, and context do not apply here. They're basically saying, if you look at it in hindsight, they're basically saying certain industries can get rich on the internet, those that monitor, surveil, and track and turn that into profit. But traditional industries, like someone writes a song, they're entitled to the money made off the song. No, you go away. Now, I wonder to what extent that's accidental, and because there was a whole ideology of freedom around information wants to be free. The song that you wrote wants and recorded wants to be free for us, but we'll make money off the top. I guess what I'm driving at with this is there's once again a confluence here where the music industry, which doesn't surveil, loses out, but YouTube and Google and Spotify and Pandora and all the others that monetize this money with poor or no compensation to creators that do surveil, they win. Is that coincidence or is that strategy?
I think it's both, and I think it's ideology and corporate strategy intertwined together. And I think John Barrella probably believed that information should be free. I mean, it's interesting because he himself is a songwriter.
Right. Good point.
He was wealthy. I mean, he comes from a wealthy family, a very family that basically I think his great grandfather founded the county, where his ranch exists in Wyoming. So he's a very rooted in the ranching business and goes back generations. So I think he wasn't necessarily dying for cash. But look, it's interesting that you talk about 1970s and pre-1970s royalties for songwriters. Is that there's right now a bill that's moving through Congress called the Access that is actually trying to get the same royalty rates for I think 1976 recordings than that exist for post 1976 recordings. I mean, this copyright law can be very confusing and hard to understand for outsiders. But right now, and so EFF is lobbying against that. Right, currently, this moment, it's lobbying against basically extending the same kind of copyright protections to songs that from 1970s and earlier, as the same protections that exist now for songs that are recorded today. And it's lobbying against that, and it has lobbied against every copyright enforcement attempt at copyright enforcement in the last 20 years. And so for Google and for Facebook, copyright has been a problem, right? Because these companies depend on other people's cultural labor and cultural production to make money, right? Google would not really exist if there wasn't stuff on the internet to search. If there were no photographs, if there were no videos, if there were no essays, if there were no news articles. It needs that cultural production that basically goes back thousands of years, right? As the soil, as the fertile soil that allows it to make money.
Yeah, I'm sorry, go ahead.
And the same thing for Facebook, right? It wouldn't really exist or be able to make money if there weren't people, billions of people, writing things, posting their videos, right? Sharing songs, doing all sorts of things. So it requires the labor, right? The social labor, cultural labor of billions of people. And so for them, copyright has always been a threat, a business threat, because it would, if they had to share their profit, right, with the billions of people that help create the content that they make their money off of, it would set a really bad precedent, and it would eat into their profit margins and in their stock valuations and things like that. So from the earliest days, copyright has been an enemy of Silicon Valley and of platforms like Google and Facebook.
And the reason why I think this is so important is because we create, or a belief system is created, a mythos, people internalize it, and then they don't even realize that it exists, or that they're looking at the world through a distorted lens. I can't tell you how many times I've been viciously attacked for saying, I think artists and songwriters and writers and other people should be fairly compensated for what they do, that I'm a fascist, I'm repressing freedom, and I guess this, to take it back to the electronic, to the EFF, first of all, the name is political, right? It's the Electronic Frontier Foundation, as if the frontier, right? As if it's wide open. And the frontier itself in the American history is a politicized term because it implies a place where there's no human inhabitants when there were. So there's already so it's taking that same ideology, it's bringing it in. It's basically opening the way for the supremacy of the big ranchers, if you will, of cyberspace, or the internet companies. And, I was always more or less a fan of the EFF. As I say, I've had them on the show. I did buy the little stickers you can put over your camera and all that sort of thing. It wasn't until I read and then I really just didn't track with what they were doing. They weren't caring about what I cared about. It wasn't until I read your piece that I realized that there is a pattern here, and that they had me all worried about government surveillance, which I certainly do worry about, but we're not saying anything to me about the other forms of surveillance, which A, can turn into government surveillance with a throwing of a switch, so to speak, but B, were also deeply invasive of my privacy in ways that are kind of troubling.
Look, exactly. The government surveillance is an issue that I think both the left and the right focus on, right? So business interests have focused on privacy, on privacy to their business practices. So they don't want the government snooping around, whether it is to enforce or environmental regulations, right, or check for financial fraud on Wall Street. Corporations generally like their privacy from the government, right? So this is an issue that's well represented on the corporate side, and of course on the left, if you're on whatever the left exists in America, of course government surveillance is a big issue, and the repressive state apparatus is a big issue. What isn't really talked about by EFF is the corporate side of surveillance. This is something that everyone is under the thumb of today.
Right.
So every time we use Facebook, every time we use Google, we're being surveilled to the maximum capability of the devices that we use. Those technologies and those platforms are built to siphon off as much data about us as possible, right? And then to mine that data and to construct psychological profiles of us, and then to use those profiles to target us for influence with targeted advertising. And that data can be essentially siphoned off and bought and rented by pretty much anybody with the cash to do it. And as we've seen with the Cambridge Analytica scandal and Facebook, these systems are now intimately involved with our democracy and with electoral processes and politics in general, and persuasion and influence. And so this is a very important issue to discuss and to grapple with. But on this issue, the Electronic Frontier Foundation is nowhere to be found. And one of the things that prompted me to actually write this article was an article by a former Electronic Frontier Foundation staffer who wrote in Slate about she was really concerned that EFF had suddenly disappeared. With all the surveillance scandals that were happening after the Trump administration came to power, Cambridge Analytica, Facebook, right? The supposed Russian government interference in our election with Facebook ads and things like that. The EFF was just like, it went AWOL. It disappeared from the conversation. Mm-hmm. Whereas normally it was on the barricades. If government surveillance was the issue, it would have been the first there, and it would have been screaming the loudest about it. Yet when private surveillance and private data gathering suddenly came to the forefront of the national conversation, it was just like poof, it disappeared. And so the staffer wrote this really genuine article saying, like, why is the EFF doing this? It really should take the lead on this issue. Why is it not? And she didn't really have a good answer for it, right? Because she said that yes, well, EFF takes some money from Google and Facebook. But she didn't really know the whole history of it, and no one knew the whole history of EFF, and so that prompted me to dig into my notes and dig into something that I worked on, while I was working on my book, and I noticed it, and I was, picking up in bits and pieces over the past several years, and I said, okay, now is the time for people to really understand what the EFF is, and the EFF is a corporate lobbyist for Silicon Valley.
So, and this gets to another point, and I encourage people to read your piece and talk about that sort of lobbying nature of EFF, but it gets to another point that I think is important, which is not only is it the issue of private sector surveillance as well as government surveillance, but at this point in our lives in this country and around the world, I would argue that the biggest digital companies have become quasi-governmental, that so much of our interaction and communication and commerce goes through these companies that they have powers that, I wrote in 2014 that some of them should be regulated as public utilities because they have some powers that, in my opinion, either are the responsibility of government or should be under the oversight of government. By the way, people thought I was crazy then, but more and more people are picking up on that idea or adopting that idea. So in other words, it's now a matter where they basically say, for example, Barlow again, we are creating a world where anyone anywhere may express his or her beliefs, no matter how singular, without fear of being coerced into silence and conformity. That's no longer true, if it ever was. That if you want to go on Facebook and articulate certain ideas, Rob Reiner will be pushing Hamilton 68, which is designed to suppress certain independent left and right voices on social media. Now, we could go on with if you're engaged in a certain, they throttled WikiLeaks when they didn't like what it did from accepting electronic banking through PayPal. I could go on with controversial organizations or opinions that get throttled, but I guess in the couple minutes we had left, do you agree with me that in a sense now to lobby for the industry means you've actually become a lobby for a kind of extrajudicial government?
Yeah, it's like, maybe the best way to think about these companies is like, Lockheed Martin of the digital age, or the Booz Allen Hamilton of the digital age. So because these companies, on the one hand, are private, but on the other hand, their ties to the government and to the national security state are so broad and deep and connect on so many different levels that they can be thought of as government contractors and as privatized extension of the government. So yeah, I totally agree with you. And right now, if you're just focusing on government surveillance or how governments can abuse technology to surveil us, you're only looking at a very small piece of the bigger picture. It's like, it's right now, I think something like 70% of the intelligence community is privatized, run by private companies like Booz Allen, Hamilton. So imagine if the only thing that you're worried about is only, government. You're only looking at government surveillance or the public aspect of the national security state, and you're ignoring the 70% of the privatized players that are actually carrying out this function and are lobbying to constantly increase it and to grow the size of the surveillance apparatus. And so I think we need to think of, yeah, you're totally right, Silicon Valley as an extension, as a privatized extension of the government. And we won't be able to really do much if we continue to think along the lines of Barlow and think of cyberspace as this free space where all we need to do is just to unregulate it, to let it run its course.
And it's ironic that the rhetoric of freedom is used in this case, because I'll tell you what, Yasha, it's a good thing that my program is on the air on Free Speech TV and in a number of affiliates around the country as a radio station, because if it weren't, and the Silicon Valley companies decided they didn't like what you and I were talking about and they didn't want to disseminate it, nobody would ever hear it. So it's my closing comment, it's ironic to me that you come to me with the rhetoric of freedom when that's the power that these companies have.
Yeah. No, and I'd like to maybe close on this. It's maybe we should adopt the idea that the internet is this frontier land. And if it is the frontier land, we're the cattle there, right? We're the companies like Google and Facebook, they're the big ranching conglomerates. They're the railroad companies, and we're the poor settlers, and we're the native inhabitants, and we're the cattle. So we're the resources that are to be extracted. And so, maybe it is the frontier, but what kind of frontier do we want it to be? Do we want it to be a frontier that's filled with exploitation and robbery, or a frontier that actually has some kind of equitable distribution of the resources in this, and a humanitarian approach to life there, and that's democratic and isn't just about robber barons and cattle barons and genocide.
Well,
yeah.
Okay, well said. We're the cattle, clickbait is the shoot, and we're issuing our own Declaration of Freedom. So, Yasha Levine, author of Surveillance Valley, and the recent article, All Effed Up in the Baffler. Thanks for writing this stuff and for doing the digging, and thanks for coming back on the program.
Thank you for having me on.